Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break. So we're going to start the next session now, and I'd like to welcome Meg, who's going to be talking about her research friendly, radical, and ambivalent. Take it away, Meg.
Great. Hi, thanks everybody for joining me today to discuss friendly, radical, ambivalent, fat librarians and professional identity. My name is Meg Galasso. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm a librarian at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. So just a couple quick notes. These slides are available on the conference program site as well as via a link that'll be at the end of this presentation. And we should have a really good chunk of time for discussion today. So please feel welcome to add comments and questions in the chat. All right, as we dive in, I want to begin with some notes on content. So first, I would like to acknowledge my positionality as a researcher and a librarian. I am a fat white woman working in an academic library at a public university here in the United States. These identities and circumstances afford me many privileges and a vested interest in advocating for fat folks, women, and libraries. I am also particularly committed to acting in solidarity with underrepresented and marginalized people more broadly, including Black and Brown folks, queer and trans folks, and those who are poor or disenfranchised. In addition to library science, my educational background is in history, particularly Black history, and this has shaped and informed many aspects of my librarianship and research. So while I contend that these various perspectives make me a better researcher and a better librarian, I do want to acknowledge that this is the position from which I approach my work. Throughout this presentation, I will use fat as a neutral descriptor. I may also use like people in fat bodies or similar terms. In doing so, I aim to avoid using stigmatizing language, particularly medical terminology. I also choose to use the terms anti-fatness or stigma or bias against fat people instead of the more ubiquitous, quote, fat phobia. As the writer and activist Aubrey Gordon has argued, presenting hostility towards fat people as a phobia is inaccurate, dismissive, and it only serves to further stigmatize those with mental illness. Finally, this research and presentation reflect the pronounced complexity of fatness and identity. Experiences in fat bodies and libraries, as in all bodies and in the rest of life, can be positive, negative, both, and everything in between. So particularly for fat folks who might be in attendance, I encourage you to take care of yourself in how you engage with this content. I hope that you will find at least something here to be resonant and affirming, though I acknowledge that some of the content may also feel deeply personal and uncomfortable. So please do take care. In the spring of 2022, I completed interviews over Zoom with 31 US-based librarians in public-facing roles who identified as fat. Interviewees were selected from a call for volunteers that asked prospective participants to answer a pretty broad range of demographic questions with open text fields. This allowed users to identify in the ways that were most resonant to them, and it allowed me to select a participant pool that was intentionally more diverse than the profession is in the United States. This was in order to amplify often marginalized voices and also to allow for intersectional analysis. So nearly half of participants were non-white, with folks identifying as white, Black, Latina and Latinx, Middle Eastern, Asian, Jewish, Hispanic, American Indian, and biracial. About 1/3 of participants identified as male, non-binary, or other. Nearly half claimed an identity that can be broadly described as queer or not straight, and about 1/3 identified as disabled in some way. While just over half of participants were working in academic libraries at the time that they were interviewed, I did strive for broad representation here as well, with participants from public, school, government, and special libraries in addition to academic institutions. Finally, I selected a pool that encompassed a wide range of years of experience in libraries, with participants ranging in experience from less than 5 years to more than 20 years in the field. So in this presentation, I will be quoting participants anonymously, sometimes highlighting certain aspects of their identity. So for example, I might say a white academic librarian, a mid-career Latina librarian, a Black woman working in public libraries, etc. When identity markers like race or gender are not noted, this is not meant to insinuate some sort of presumed normative identity. It would just be impractical to describe each quote from each librarian with their full demographic profile. But I do try to make note of this information when it is particularly relevant to the topic. But that said, whether it's explicitly stated or not, all of the librarians quoted today are indeed fat. I want to take a quick moment to once again thank these librarians for their participation in this study. These conversations weren't always easy, and it's quite rare for most of us to talk to anyone, much less a stranger, about a topic that is so fraught and intimate. So I thank them for their candor and their willingness to be vulnerable, and I hope that this research helps them to feel seen and represented in LIS scholarship. So I've previously discussed this study in two venues, a conference paper for ACRL 2023 and a presentation for Region 6 of the Network of the National Library of Medicine, links to both of which are included in the references. So as reported there, some broad themes emerge from this study of fat librarians in public-facing roles. These include the challenges of navigating normative spaces, their surveillance of fat bodies by both users and colleagues, the ways in which fat folks perform professionalism, and the complexity of visibility for librarians in fat bodies. These themes both align with and significantly expand upon other published scholarship about fatness in librarianship, most notably a 2020 book chapter by Verslush, Agostino, and Cassidy, which served as a major catalyst for my work. Their chapter, Fat, Fit, and Femme, Exploring Performative Femininity for Fat Female Librarians, is cited in the reference slides, and I highly recommend taking the time to read it. I provided participants with 13 questions in advance of their interviews. These are included in their entirety in the appendix to my contributed paper, which is again in the reference slides. These questions were both broad and specific, seeking to understand the experiences of fat librarians who work with the public. Two questions most precisely aim to elicit responses about fatness and professional identity. First, how has your experience doing public-facing library work in a fat body informed your approach to librarianship? And second, to what extent does your fatness align or conflict with your professional identity as a librarian, and in what ways? Two additional questions yielded responses that were relevant to today's topic of professional identity. Do you think that your size makes you more or less approachable to users compared to other colleagues? Please describe. And in what ways do you see other aspects of your identity, for example, gender, sexual orientation, ability, race, or ethnicity, as intersecting with your fatness and how you are perceived by others? I will note that after the first interview, I began adding in age to that list of examples when I verbally asked the question. In this study, responses from interviewees revealed the extent to which fatness affects their professional identities, how we both fit within and simultaneously defy stereotypes, how we approach our work and our careers, how the visibility of our otherness affects our perceived and our performed professional personas. As described by Klein and Lenart, one is not a librarian by virtue of an elegantly lofty job title or description, but rather by virtue of the numerous messy, complex, and unique relations that emerge through interactions between librarians and library users. In this way, professional identity is not fixed nor inherent, but continually being constructed by librarians' experiences and their reflections upon and reactions to those experiences. Professional identity is how we see ourselves within the profession and within the daily work of librarianship. I use the term persona to discuss the externalized performance of identity, applying the Jungian idea of the mask that we wear to present ourselves. As Pegowski and Rigby state in the opening chapter of their 2014 book on the librarian stereotype, librarians are in the business of presentation. Indeed, we are always presenting information or presenting ourselves, and these presentations sit at the intersection of authenticity and construction, both consciously and subconsciously performed, perceived, and judged. That librarians in this study articulated a wide variety of stereotypes of librarians, describing the ways in which they presume users to perceive librarians, and also how they themselves perceived librarians prior to joining the profession. Particularly for fat white women in this study, librarianship as a professional identity mapped neatly onto many stereotypes, including the pretty pudgy girls who eat snacks and curl up and read books, and the old motherly librarian who sits behind the desk. These remarks, as echoed by other participants, demonstrate the ways in which stereotypes about fatness and gender are mediated by age. Motherly, mothering, maternal, and caring came up frequently in interviews with fat women librarians, mostly those who identified as white, but to a lesser extent also women of color. Verslush et al. Discuss the ways in which femininity for fat femme librarians is often interpreted and expressed as maternal in some way, both rewarding and creating expectations of personalized care and attention. We'll come back to this idea later, but I think it's important to note here that fatness, whiteness, and femaleness are perceived as in alignment with stereotypes of librarians as maternal figures and of librarians in general. As stated by one participant, it's not seen as transgressive to be a fat white librarian who's also female. This assertion is both perception and fact, particularly for whiteness and femaleness among librarians in the United States. However, its plain-spoken accuracy is also an invitation for interrogation and action. Women and femmes who participated in this study had diverse experiences of the ways in which their fatness affected their sexualization in the library as a workplace. Some noted the ways in which their fatness seemed to insulate them from the fetishized and eroticized stereotypes of librarians. Notably, also, though, remarking on the inverse of that stereotype that they also defied, described by one participant as Marian the librarian, prude, skinny. For those who may not be familiar with this admittedly somewhat dated reference, Marian the librarian is the reluctant love interest of the con man Harold Hill in the classic musical The Music Man. While white and white presenting librarians often describe their fatness as protective, that their size shielded them from much of the sexual harassment experienced by thinner colleagues, this contrasted with librarians of color, particularly Black and Latino women, who described receiving romantic and sexual attention from users in ways that were seldom described by white participants. As explored by scholars from many disciplines, the sexualization of women of color, including and even in particular fat women of color, has both historical roots and current manifestations. The fat librarians of color in this study expressed a variety of feelings about how their sexualization informed their professional identities. Most took the sexual harassment in stride, stating that it's unwelcome, but also just to be expected when interacting with the public. One Latina librarian talked about being hit on and catcalled at work. When I asked how that made her feel, she responded, "It's annoying and shitty in the sense that I'm a full-ass professional and you are reducing me to this juicy booty." None of the fat women of color in this study indicated that the sexual harassment that they received at work made them feel unsafe or even unwelcome in libraries. Rather, this librarian seemed to capture the broader sentiment that their sexualization in the library workplace was just annoying and shitty. The fat men who participated in this study understood their gender and fatness to contrast with stereotypes of librarianship, but particularly their gender. Male librarians described circumstances in which users assumed that they weren't librarians or real librarians, and instead sought the assistance of female presenting colleagues. Men also discussed the impact of their wardrobes on how they were treated, noting how they felt more respected by users and colleagues when they were dressed more formally. However, this placed an additional burden of wearing hot and uncomfortable blazers and ties when doing the often physical labor of public-facing work. walking folks through libraries, shelving books while kneeling or sitting on the floor, or teaching in a crowded lecture hall. A quick note here that women and non-binary folks who I interviewed also had a lot to say about wardrobe and the challenges of dressing professionally and approachably in a fat body. I discussed this a bit more in the other cited venues, but I'm always happy to talk about it further. When asked how his fatness interacted with other aspects of his identity, one longtime academic librarian provided insight on his gender and queerness in his professional experiences. "Oh, you're a male librarian and you're not married? You must be gay." There's this assumption that if you're a man in a typically female profession and you're not like a PE teacher, people will start to question. Unless you're a director. Directors are old, straight white men. But people don't realize that they had to climb up the ranks while you were making these assumptions about them. The intersection of queerness, fatness, and maleness for these librarians is worthy of much more exploration than my sample size permits. But if folks are aware of this research being done or topic being discussed elsewhere, I would love to hear more about it. And if you happen to be a fat queer man working in libraries listening to this presentation, I'd be curious to hear more about your experiences during our discussion. When I asked participants about the extent to which their fatness aligned or conflicted with their professional identity as a librarian, many reflected on how they chose this field in the first place and the ways in which they first conceptualized themselves as a librarian. As one Hispanic public librarian described it, "When I wanted to get my master's degree, I thought about the people around me. And a lot of the librarians I know and love and respect, a lot of them are in a fat body." Another librarian remembered her mother telling a family friend that she would be working in a library. The family friend expressed relief because, quote, "they're more accepting of people like her." This was clearly, and for better or worse, understood to be about her fatness. One librarian, a white woman who has worked in academic libraries for more than 20 years, described her decision to enter librarianship after working in other cultural heritage institutions. "I need to find a field that I can be myself in. I don't want to wear makeup. I don't want to wear high-heeled shoes. I don't want to wear nylons. I chose the librarian profession because I saw more women like me there. I saw it as a place where I'll be accepted and someplace I can grow old in. I looked at offices and said, well, there aren't many older women there. So I went for a field that welcomed women, welcomed diverse women. I went into a field I could grow into." Fat librarians in this study had many ways to describe the ways in which librarianship is welcoming to women, non-binary folks, fat people, and folks with disabilities. Like the previously quoted librarian, multiple participants in this study described intentionally entering the field due to the diversity and acceptance within librarianship. Others discovered this aspect of the profession after joining it. As one participant noted, "I have worked with enough other librarians to know that we come in all shapes and sizes." Participants described choosing librarianship as a career field in which they could belong and be accepted, a career in which their fatness would not conflict with professional ideals that value liberation, equitable access to information, and inclusivity. However, as summarized by one fat librarian, that acceptance and belonging can have its limits. "Librarianship is more accepting than other fields. Like I see more diversity of gender and fatness, not necessarily diversity as far as people of color. We all know that." Indeed, librarianship in the United States remains stubbornly and overwhelmingly white and female. While some participants of color noted that they anticipated a lack of diversity when they entered the field, others were more surprised by their relative uniqueness among colleagues, especially as their careers progressed. To quote one Hispanic woman working in public libraries, "The idea that when I moved up in the library world that there would be less people of color, that was mind-blowing to me." Some fat librarians of color interviewed in this study either currently worked in or had previously worked in libraries with majority minority communities. They described the ways in which their racial or ethnic identity within those communities and their fatness were mutually reinforcing, increasing their feelings of belonging, both within their libraries and within the profession. But that said, this was far from universal, and many fat librarians of color in this study described working in majority white institutions in which they felt tokenized or unwelcome. Following some particularly negative experiences with colleagues, one public librarian wrestled with the extent to which she wanted to embrace her identity as a Mexican woman, explaining that while she used to embody and celebrate this aspect of her identity with pride, she no longer wanted to do so. I felt like I had to work 3 times as hard as everyone else for basically no recognition, for people just to take my work or not take me seriously. After that, I don't want to say I ditched my identity because of that, but I didn't wear it on my sleeve like I used to. But unfortunately, being fat is something I can't hide. It's something I am. This idea that fatness is an identity that is utterly and inescapably visible was described by some participants as an unfortunate reality. And I will note that not all participants, nor volunteers in the call for participants, accepted the premise that fatness is in and of itself an identity. As stated by one participant, I don't identify as fat. I am fat. Claiming a shared identity, though, is often the first step to not only feeling a sense of belonging, but then turning that belonging into solidarity and advocacy. Indeed, librarians in this study who strongly identified as fat conceptualize themselves as belonging to a wider group of folks whose identities placed them outside the norm, their fatness signaling shared otherness to users, their bodies making visible their ability to empathetically serve library users from a variety of backgrounds. That said, participants in this study also noted some significant boundaries when it came to their fatness and professional belonging, particularly as they moved through their career. Multiple librarians remarked upon the ways in which their fatness aligned with their identity as a librarian in general, but conflicted with their greater professional communities or aspirations. One librarian, whose size has fluctuated throughout her career, noted that her colleagues and users seemed more comfortable working with her when her body was smaller. Academic librarians who worked with faculty and students from the disciplines of business and the health sciences felt that their fatness created an ever-present rift between themselves and their patrons, who were described as prioritizing physical attractiveness and expressing more weight stigma. Many fat librarians noted a need to work harder, produce more, and create more welcoming environments for their users compared to their thinner colleagues, in order to account for the perceived deficit of fatness. I feel like I have to be 1,000,000 times better than the next person because I have an automatic negative in my column. In this way, anti-fatness makes itself manifest in the daily activities of fat librarians, whether we encounter outright hostility or not. While most participants described general acceptance as a fat person in librarianship, those in or seeking leadership roles felt that acceptance come under strain. One librarian was specifically told that he needed to, quote, work on his physicality in order to be considered for future promotions. Another remarked that while she felt comfortable in her fat body among fellow librarians, her size made her feel hyper-visible and isolated among other library administrators. One librarian grappled with the extent to which her fatness rendered her less eligible for her ambition of becoming a library director. How is my body perceived? Is it perceived as a leader, or is it perceived as a jolly fat children's librarian? As described by multiple librarians in this study, their fatness presents both an imagined and very real barrier to promotion and leadership within the profession. Now, on jolliness, you'll recall that in these interviews, I specifically asked participants if they thought that their fatness made them more or less approachable to users. While I certainly could have explored this question by surveying users with like pictures of real or hypothetical bodies of fat librarians, and similar research has been done about other visible identities, I'll be frank in saying that I personally am just like not that interested in what thin folks have to say about fat folks or fat librarians. I'm far more interested in how fat librarians themselves move through and think and feel about the work in our world. This approach did cause some discomfort for some participants who didn't feel qualified to answer the question of whether they were more or less approachable. When they did express this hesitation, which was often expressed as being concerned that they didn't have like direct evidence, I reminded them that this research was meant to center not only their experiences as fat librarians, but also how they felt about those experiences. In their responses, the vast majority of fat librarians in this study emphasized not only their approachability, but specifically their friendliness, both performed and perceived. As one librarian put it, fat librarians are just less intimidating and maybe even assumed to be less pretentious than our thinner colleagues. Our bodies render us more approachable, friendlier, more accessible to users. Fat librarians use the words jolly and jovial to describe how they were perceived, with one queer, non-binary librarian stating that most of their young users think of them as a jolly, happy fat woman. Note this summary is layered in its implications, that with only visual cues, users would perceive not only body size and gender, even if that perception is inaccurate, but also personality, jolliness. Friendliness was often described as an enhanced version of approachability, a quality that is intentionally performed. One librarian described creating a librarian persona that is friendly and emphatic, almost aggressively so. Come to the library. I want to help you. That's my job. You're doing a project. I want to help. I want to know everything. Multiple participants, including many academic and special librarians, in addition to those in public libraries, express something similar, a hyper-friendly persona meant to be as welcoming as possible for their users, particularly students. Indeed, librarians in this study often spoke about using the presumption of friendliness, which was to some extent based on their fatness, as an asset or a tool in how they do their work. They described the ways in which this pronounced approachability was actually a professional advantage in their work and careers. As a non-binary mid-career academic librarian summarized, students perceive me as a very non-threatening, approachable person, and I've tried to just lean hard into that. I try to be friendly and fun and a jovial fat person in a way that makes people more comfortable. In a culture in which our fatness is so often demonized and perceived as a negative, as was described by librarians in this study who were seeking promotions, it feels important to note this way in which our size can benefit our performance and therefore our careers. And don't worry, we will complicate this idea of fatness and users' comfort here in a minute. One librarian described his ideal version of himself, or the librarian he aims to be. In my ideal mind, my professional identity as a librarian is friendly, approachable, ready to answer any questions. I feel like my size makes me friendlier to others. I tend to gravitate more to someone who is plus-sized, and I don't know if it's how my mind perceives it or if it's just personal preference. But I feel like I hope that if that's true of my own perception, then it's true of others' perception as well. Like they see me and sort of gravitate towards me. Like, yes, I can certainly help you. I'm definitely more friendly. Many fat librarians interviewed described a professional identity that was constructed in relation to their users as helpers whose enthusiastic performance of approachability and availability for service is central to their identity as a librarian. This aligns with the previous assertion from Klein and Lennart that our identities are not fixed or essential, but rather shift in relation to our users and our experiences with them. When we see users respond positively to our performed and embodied approachability, and when we are professionally rewarded for our positive rapport with users, we are more likely to incorporate that into our daily practice and our personas. While librarians emphasized and broadly appreciated the ways in which their fatness enhanced their approachability, this aspect of public-facing work, the perception and performance of emphatic friendliness, can take its toll. Participants cited the at times immense emotional labor required to perform the role of the supportive fat librarian, who can resolve not only big reference questions, but also big feelings, describing the particular demand on fat female presenting librarians to fulfill a motherly role. Notably, a couple of public librarians really embraced this more maternal, more emotional role in their professional identities. But for others, this dissonance between user expectations and their own personas was acute. One school librarian described herself as, quote, a more serious person, not one of those happy-go-lucky fat people. One public librarian noted the ways in which their fatness demanded compliance. I take up more space physically, and I don't feel like that lends itself to causing problems or saying no or having an off hour at the desk. An off hour being like, I don't want to perform this customer service. Fatness is taking up too much space to allow for resting bitch face. This quote speaks to the ambivalence described by participants in both their identity as a fat person in the world and as a librarian. Indeed, there is an incentive to capitalize on the perceived warmth and friendliness of being a fat person available behind a reference desk. But to what extent does this come at the cost of respect for our time and our expertise when collaborating with researchers and stakeholders, or at the cost of doing our work authentically? In their 2023 article on performative pedagogy, Mapes and Asher contend that the insistence upon delivering education with a smile often exacerbates oppressive hierarchies of a white supremacist heteropatriarchy. How does this translate to the work of a public-facing librarian whose ability to do their work often necessitates openness, approachability, or as interviewees described it, friendliness? And what does it mean to do this work when users have even more outsized expectations of joyful, motherly service based on the fatness of our bodies? Again, I go back to the previously quoted librarian who described using assumptions about their friendliness as a tool, of performing the role of jovial, fun, fat librarian in a way that makes people more comfortable. Librarians in this study describe personas performed and behaviors adopted to avoid coming across as a mean fat girl, with one directly contrasting a fat person who is perceived as jovial or jolly, with, quote, that girl who is mean and bitter because she's overweight. Fat librarians' professional identities and personas are sites of constant negotiation between user and employer expectations and their own authentic approach to the work, informed and complicated by the perceptions and assumptions of an anti-fat culture. As summarized by one librarian, I experience ambivalence about both fatness and professional identity, that feeling of wanting to have more of an identity or confidence in my identity, both as a librarian and as a fat person, wanting to approach both with consciousness and sensitivity or self-compassion. This harkens back to the volunteers and participants who really wrestled with the idea of identifying as fat, of seeing their body size as part of or even central to their identity as both a person and more specifically a librarian. It also speaks to the never-ending and complex process of constructing a professional identity in which we think critically, reflect on our experiences and our values, and demonstrate care for ourselves and others. In contrast with this ambivalence, however, many librarians express pride and certainty in how they constructed and presented a persona as a fat, radical librarian. Now, this is almost certainly, at least in part, due to a self-selection bias. Librarians who feel strongly about their identities were far more likely to respond to the call for volunteers. Yet, the responses from these librarians are still significant, as they represent the perspectives of knowledge workers who embody and express solidarity with radical causes after considerable time and energy spent critically examining and refining not only their professional identity, but also their fatness. They are, as one librarian put it, fat people who know about fatness. A white woman working in a special library described it this way: my fatness aligns with my professional identity in the sense of being an outlier in the dominant culture by just rejecting those ideals of body conformity. A Latina woman in public libraries spoke about her fatness in the context of being a librarian. We side with liberation and liberatory practices, beliefs and such, especially freedom of information, so it aligns very well. Broadly described, librarians in this study constructed a professional identity centered on challenging norms, welcoming those who often feel unwelcome, and seeking to create more opportunities for more people to participate in libraries. As one Black academic librarian put it, it's a very radical stance to say, I'm okay with being fat. And I think that I would definitely be considered a pretty radical librarian. I tend to be a very inclusive librarian, not one for the status quo, but more of a burn it down and start from scratch and make it something that's actually for everyone kind of librarian. This okayness with fatness that was described by multiple participants, describing how they dressed in ways that felt comfortable and authentic to them rather than in ways meant to hide their bodies. They described challenging diet talk and demeaning body talk in their break rooms. And they described approaching public facing work with confidence. These fat librarians described advocating for more inclusive programs at their public libraries, pushing back against ableist spaces, frameworks, and expectations, and intentionally seeking out and serving queer and immigrant communities. Actively accepting and embracing fatness was described as in alignment with an approach to librarianship that prioritizes liberation and inclusivity. While we as a profession often proclaim these values, I'm certain that we all can think of previous or current workplaces with punitive late fees, overly policed properties, policies meant to discourage library use by certain people in our communities, or collections that fail to capture the breadth and diversity of human experience and scholarship. For many fat librarians interviewed, their fatness enhanced their ability to not only recognize these moments when we fail to uphold the values of librarianship, their identity-rooted fatness also empowered them to make the changes necessary to do and to be better. So these interviews were conducted in the spring of 2022, which is now somehow 3 years ago. And in these past 3 years, the landscape of anti-fatness has changed in some really significant ways. Now, I do want to make it clear that things were far from perfect in 2022 when I did these interviews. We were dealing with the amplified rhetoric of anti-fatness in the context of the COVID pandemic, the ever-present political and economic instability of capitalism, and so much more. But we've seen certain harmful trends escalate, accelerate, and gain legitimacy. Perhaps most notably, the emergence and popularization of GLP-1 agonists and receptor agonists, like Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, and others, as a prescription for weight loss has had a dramatic effect on how people are discussed and treated in the media, in the workplace, in their physicians' offices, and at home. This Google Trends chart for worldwide searches for Ozempic, the most ubiquitous of the GLP-1s, is but one representation of the precipitous rise in general interest and popularity of a class of drugs that were once prescribed to treat diabetes and are now chiefly marketed as a way to lose weight. The rise of GLP-1s as a weight loss drug category has both coincided with and contributed to the renewed fetishization of anti-fatness across the ideological spectrum and embedded in a wide range of cultural conversations. Back in 2022, many participants cited the body positivity movement and the visibility of fat folks in popular culture as welcome shifts that had improved their own relationships to their bodies and to the culture around them. But things are looking bleak for fat folks here in 2025 in the wake of the popularity of drugs like Ozempic. Pharmaceutical companies and those paid and unpaid boosters who promote the use of weight loss drugs are marketing these medications with what is claimed to be progressive anti-bias messaging, framing fatness as a disease and condemning weight stigma. Meanwhile, a wide range of media figures and publications are celebrating the possibility of obliterating fatness, celebrating the possibility of a world without fat people. These messages are promoted as mutually reinforcing, that we can rid the world of fat people and reduce stigma against them at the same time. Fat folks know otherwise. Fat librarians are now moving through the world and their libraries in bodies that many view to not only be in need of a solution, but now quite easily solved. This, of course, does not account for the complexity of the impact of adoption, both broadly and individually. These medications are increasingly expensive and difficult to access, with some people resorting to suspect and often unlicensed online and overseas compounding pharmacies. The increasing demand has also created shortages for those who rely on these medications to treat diabetes. Further, one must consider the environmental impact of producing and disposing of millions of single-use injectors, in addition to the not insignificant potential side effects, as well as the likelihood of lifelong medication to maintain whatever weight is lost. Now, I do not want this to be taken as a condemnation of fat people who choose to use GLP-1s for weight loss. To the contrary, it is completely understandable for people to want to make use of any intervention possible to become unfat, or at least less fat, in a society that does so much harm to fat people. So, like weight loss surgeries and the other prescription drugs that have been on the market, medical interventions for weight loss are nothing new. But the popularity of GLP-1s is, and it presents a new host of challenges for fat librarians. At the same time, we are experiencing ever-escalating attacks on diversity initiatives and programs in the United States. From the granular, like challenges to individual books and library collections, to the broader legislative and judicial attempts to erase years of progress on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, including gutting affirmative action. Perhaps most concerning, many organizations, including corporations, state and local governments, and universities, are obeying in advance of any legislative or judicial directives by choosing to shutter DEI-related offices and task forces, to end inclusive hiring practices. They're striking pronouns from signature lines and removing web content. The extent to which fatness has ever been included in conversations about diversity is dependent on many factors, though some progress had been made in recent years. Amidst this broader assault on diversity as a concept, the conditions are particularly hostile to creating space for the dignity and liberation of fat folks, particularly as so many fat people embody other marginalized identities. As one admittedly small and personal example, the presentation that I gave for Region 6 of the Network of the National Library of Medicine here in the US, gave this presentation in 2023. It was recently removed from YouTube without my knowledge, nor the knowledge of the librarian who led the webinar series. With the context of the sweeping removal of content from federal and federal adjacent websites, we can only assume that this was because the webinar series and session title included the acronym DEIA, so it therefore likely got caught in some clumsy, overly generic keyword search, or it was subject to a bad faith complaint. I have since re-uploaded my presentation to my institutional repository, so it is now available to researchers and practitioners again. But this action by the federal government has rendered this work far less discoverable for fat librarians and their allies who are seeking relevant research. Mounting levels of anti-fatness and attacks on diversity initiatives both constitute and reflect rising fascism and eugenics in policy and culture, both within and outside of the United States. Again, while these factors were certainly present in 2022, the reemergence and reelection of Donald Trump and the outsized influence of not only his vice president and figures like Elon Musk and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has led to the platforming and promotion of fascist and eugenicist policy, which we are seeing embraced by growing segments of mainstream culture. Legislation, executive orders, and emboldened conservative content creators are targeting a wide range of people, including trans folks, anti-war activists, and immigrants who challenge the fragile yet persistent white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative power structure. New policy reflects and reinforces ableist and individualistic wellness culture, aiming to remove the public from public health, to deepen existing stigmas against those with disabilities, and to promote eugenicist so-called pronatalism by restricting reproductive health care. The rise of fascism and eugenics is fueled by and fueling pervasive anti-intellectualism, which seeks to undermine expertise and critical thinking, and ultimately to create conditions hostile to an educated and empowered citizenry. Again, the state of the world was not perfect in 2022 when I first conducted my interviews. Many of these patterns were already in development, and thinking in the larger scale of human history, we have faced and fought fascism before. But it's still worth saying that things, they just aren't that great right now. So what does this mean for fat librarians? We, particularly those of us who embody multiple marginalized identities, are carrying the additional burden of emboldened anti-fatness in a climate that is hostile to the mission and values of librarianship. This current climate represents an apex in anti-intellectualism, an environment in which the production and distribution of knowledge is not only discouraged, but viewed with suspicion. These days, it is tough to be a person invested in the freedom of information and expression, in individual rights to privacy and self-determination, and in the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in public life. Librarians have been feeling this acutely. Fat librarians are not unique in facing these professional and personal challenges. Librarians of color, gender nonconforming librarians, librarians with loved ones at risk of deportation, librarians with disabilities. All librarians have it rough right now. We all do. It is just worth noting that anti-fatness compounds existing challenges in ways that deserve examination and advocacy. So by asking these questions and creating the opportunities for these librarians to consider the ways in which their fatness, gender, age, race, ethnicity shape and inform their professional identities, I know that I have therefore affected how some of these librarians think about and do their work. I know this to be true because these interviews have affected my own work and identity. Some participants mentioned that they had never thought about their fatness in relation to their professional work before seeing my call for volunteers. Some had profoundly emotional responses to reading and answering the interview questions. So while this work is at times difficult, I like to think that our critical approach to identity and a critical approach to our profession is beneficial. That seeing ourselves more clearly allows us to approach our work with more intentionality and a heightened awareness of how we relate to our users and one another. This work can also be quite fraught when the identity is one that is so often perceived so negatively by the broader culture. Indeed, some participants noted that the impact of their fatness on their work was almost entirely negative or painful to consider. But amidst this complexity, I do think it's important to remember what some participants had to say in this study. For fat library workers, our visible otherness, our rejection of conformity and normativity, can be incredibly meaningful for our users and communities. If my fat body can make a fat user feel seen and represented in the academy, if it can make them feel comfortable asking me a question that they would never typically ask another librarian or professor, if it can make them feel like they belong, then I'm happy to bear that weight. Further, we can use our perspective that our fatness affords to advocate for more inclusive libraries for all by challenging white supremacist, heteronormative, patriarchal, ableist library policies, practices, and programs. And if you are seeking some practical steps to take to help you confront and combat anti-fatness in your library work, I do have a chapter in the newly published book, Well-Being in the Library Workplace, a Handbook for Managers. This chapter provides context on anti-fatness more generally and in libraries specifically, and then it recommends actions that librarians and library managers can take to make their libraries more inclusive, speaking directly to both fat folks and non-fat folks who are engaged in this work. I really highly recommend the whole volume. There are some really great chapters in here about disability, burnout, having difficult conversations, moral injury, and a lot more. But that said, if you would like to start by just reading my chapter on anti-fatness, I have included a link to access this for free at a couple of points within these slides. All right, so here we have some robust references and recommended works. I will note that you will find some medicalized and other terminology in these citations, so do take care. This list includes academic works from many disciplines, podcasts, there's a documentary or two, and some reporting and popular works. These are mostly just recent publications, but there are some older ones in there as well. I am far from the sole voice participating in these scholarly and popular conversations, and there are works here written from a diversity of perspectives. Again, this is far from an exhaustive list, but it is a starting point. Okay, I've included my contact info and some relevant links here, but now I'm really excited to have some time for questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks, Meg. That was a fantastic presentation. And if you get a chance to look through the chat, really, really active, lots of folks sort of
Great.
contributing their own experiences as well and their own thoughts. I can pick out a couple of questions from the chat. Are you
Please.
okay with people raising their hands and giving any questions vocally as well?
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. What I'll do is I will allow people to unmute themselves. So if anyone does have any questions, if you just raise your hand. To start with, though, I'll pick out a question from the chat. So Charlie asked, um, there are levels of excuse me, there are levels of privilege within fatness. Did any interviewees touch upon this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the ones who spoke about it most were those who considered themselves to be small fats, right? Folks who were not on the larger end of the fat spectrum. They were like keenly aware of their privilege in that and really made note of it in ways that I really appreciated. I will say that my own fatness has like fluctuated and my own privilege within the fat community has fluctuated from when I first started this research to now. And so I have found it interesting to reflect upon and continue to analyze these interviews from that perspective of a person who was on the smaller end of the fat community at the time and now finds myself on a larger end. So that has been really interesting. But I will say that yes, interviewees did talk about the privileges of being a smaller fat person when we discussed the topic.
Yeah. I can't see any hands raised. So I'm just going to pick out another question from the chat. Um, boom. So Jenny has asked, this may be a British cultural thing, but did you find that the maternalized role also involved being the one to say, no, I'm always the one sought out to be the bad guy for patron problems?
Yes, I can think specifically there was one interviewee in particular who talked about being the enforcer in her public library. Like that was the role that she played, right? And I do think it's also important to note that like the no can come from like the policy enforcement standpoint, right? When the person wanted a fine waived, right? Or to be able to check out something from the reference shelf, right? Like that kind of enforcement. But also like more like a security enforcement type role, right? The extent to which we have policing or security in our libraries varies widely. Because yeah, there's one of the librarians, she was really specifically talking about how she was the enforcer, especially like getting people to leave when the library was closing, that she was often called upon to do that. And she wondered whether it was because of like her kind of imposing size was part of it. But then also other librarians talking about like being the one asked to come deal with like teen user issues, even when they were not the teen librarians. They would be called in. And so I think that speaks to that like maternal role of like the teens being more respectful or more likely to comply when the message was coming from a maternal figure. Um, but then also those librarians, because I would ask them how they felt about that, about being the enforcer, right? About being the maternal figure. And like there were really complex things to say because they said that part of it they think is because like they just were more comfortable absorbing abuse, right? Like that when they were kicking somebody out at the end of the night who wasn't happy about it, that, you know, part of my language, this is a direct quote, but like if they were called a fat bitch, like they were used to it. It wouldn't phase them. Whereas those kind of, you know, that kind of abuse wouldn't be handled as well by people who weren't used to it, which I thought was really interesting. But then there was one librarian who was like, yeah, when I'm called over to the teen department to deal with rowdy teens and they call me fat or they mumble things under their breath, I believe she said, you know, she's dealt with much worse than whatever they could possibly deal her. So like she was happy to help out.
Thank you. I think
Yeah.
Jess's head might have fallen off from nodding along to that. Jess said that she was always the one that had to go and have a word with the lads when they were throwing chairs at each other. Um,
Yeah.
Holly, I can see you've got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi guys. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And Meg, that was unbelievable. Just so fascinating and emotional and just amazing. So well done. I just wondered, in your call out for participants, did you put
Mhm.
certain parameters in place, or was it all just about self-identifying? We all know someone who
Yeah,
calls themselves fat, who you're, you're in that awkward situation. You're like, no.
yeah,
And I just wondered how you went about approaching that. So yeah, thank you so much.
yeah. No, thank you. And that was something that I thought really long and hard about when doing, oh my gosh, the call for volunteers. It took me forever to put that together because I did want to be very intentional about it. And I ended up just deciding, do you identify as fat? Yes, no, or other with an open text field. And I decided, and this is something that like a lot of fat studies scholars and activists talk about, is like we have to allow room for self-identification in this work. Because yeah, we do. We all know the person who's so terribly fat, but still easily fits into clothes that are sold at mainstream stores, right? And doesn't face any of the physical barriers, right? Or cultural barriers to their fatness. But yeah, I just decided, do you identify as fat? Yes, no, or other. I wrestled with the idea of like trying to come up with some sort of a like small fat, mid-size fat, large fat, super fat, right? Like kind of using the terms of the fat liberation community. Um, but I decided to go with just, do you identify as fat? And hoped and presumed that there would be kind of a distribution of folks who, um, yeah, who responded. But I will say that is the one of the situations, and with multiple people clicked the other and some variation of I don't identify as fat, like I am fat, right? I also had some folks who contributed with I'm not as fat now, but I have been fat in the past, right? I don't know if this counts, but I had weight loss surgery, 4 years ago, those sorts of things. So people were demonstrating in that call for volunteers that they had some, that they were kind of wrestling with that idea as well.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, we've got a couple of minutes left if anyone else has any questions and want to raise their hand.
Yeah, please vote. Or comments, right? I know, like, if there are things that you feel like you need to express out loud, I also am welcome to hearing that. I know this is personal work.
Nancy, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out Diana's question in the chat um, about differences in perceptions between the UK, where obesity is not so prevalent. I also have a vested interest because I'm in France, and the politics of weight in France are also difficult.
Thank you for spotting
Yes.
that
And
for
I,
me, Nancy. I missed that one.
no, yeah, I do think that that's really, and I was curious to speak with you all to get more of that perspective because of course, my sample is limited to US based librarians. I did have a couple of folks who remarked upon working overseas, working abroad in libraries. Some with like military and special libraries who had like a really interesting example because they had like the life on a US military base, right, where they were working in a library and then the broader culture in which they were living. And so they kind of were getting to see those things like kind of conflicting and like changing in different ways. Because, yeah, one did remark that their time in Germany was really well appreciated because they felt that in Germany there was this, and of course, this is just one person's explanation of the German feelings on fatness and bodies, right? So take that for what you will. But they talked about how, in contrast to their work in US libraries and in US culture, there just seemed to be a broader acceptance of like bodies in their many forms, right? Was how they interpreted it, and like less just like hand wringing about fatness and it being less present, in the forefront of folks' minds. But then also, Nancy, speaking particularly to France, and I don't know if this comports with your experience, but experiencing like acute levels of anti-fatness when they were working in France. And then one other that I think is worth surfacing, a librarian who spoke about leading a trip of undergraduate students to like on a tour of some South Asian countries, um, discussing her experiences doing so for herself in a fat body and her students who were fat, and it being incredibly difficult, not only logistically, but also culturally. A lot of really overtly hostile comments and a lot of things that made her very uncomfortable and made her very uncomfortable putting her fat students in that situation. So she actually talked about not doing one of those trips again to that region because of it. So yeah, I do think that this demonstrates the extent to which like fatness, anti-fatness, and how it shows up in all ways, but also in our work can be very different in different cultural contexts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're just coming up on the hour, so I think we'll wrap up there. But if everyone in the chat could just express their thanks to Meg with what was a fantastic piece of research and a great presentation. I'll save a copy of the chat for folks because I know there's a few things in there people might like. So we've got another 15-minute break. So again, please do make sure that you take that break. Don't check emails. I'm going to say it again, go touch grass, stand under a tree, get outside for 15 minutes, and then we'll be back with our next sessions after. Thank you very much, everybody.
Right.